My ex-boyfriend, Lucas, always had a knack for doing things without thinking about how they'd affect me. But when he invited my estranged parents to my house without telling me, that was the last straw. We had been struggling for a while, and I had already told him I didn't want anything to do with them anymore. After everything they had put me through, everything I had been forced to endure, there was no room left in my life for them. So, when I found out Lucas had invited my parents over behind my back, I felt like I had been sucker punched. My parents? The same people who had made my 18th birthday a living nightmare by literally kicking me out of the house? That was the kind of trauma I could never forget. To Lucas, it was just a mistake, but to me, it was a betrayal. The walls of the life I had worked so hard to build started to crumble right in front of me. I didn't even know how to begin to explain to him how deeply hurt I was. It wasn't just that he invited them without asking. It was that he couldn't understand why I didn't want them in my life. Why didn't he get it? Why couldn't he see that I was trying to protect myself from people who had done nothing but harm me? I broke up with him that night. I thought it would be the end, but it wasn't. The stalking started soon after. First, it was subtle. He sent a few texts, apologizing, asking for another chance. Then came the calls. Dozens of them, sometimes back to back. His voicemails were always the same, desperate, pleading, full of promises to make things right. When I didn't respond, he escalated. He started showing up at my work, standing outside my apartment building, just waiting for a glimpse of me. I was scared, but at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder if I had done the right thing. I had loved Lucas at one point. We had shared so many moments together, but now everything felt poisoned. The relationship, the trust, the future I had imagined with him, it was all gone. I had to protect myself, but the more he chased me, the more I realized just how far gone he was. Finally, I had enough. I went to the police and filed a restraining order against him. I had never been so afraid of someone before, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. The day they arrested him, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. Or at least that's what I thought. It wasn't long before I met John. He was everything Lucas wasn't. Calm, understanding, and incredibly supportive. We connected quickly, and for a while, things seemed perfect. I told him about my family life, about my parents, about how they had abandoned me when I turned 18, and how I had spent years rebuilding my life without them. John listened intently, never once judging me. He seemed to genuinely care. But after a few months, things started to change. It began with casual questions about how I was feeling about my parents. "How are things with them now?" he'd ask. But I always told him the same thing. I didn't have a relationship
Hey everyone,
with them.
I've been going back and forth about whether or not I should
wasn't
share
ready
this.
to forgive them.
But
after a
and
lot
that
of
was when the
thinking,
pressure started.
I feel like
John
didn't understand why I wouldn't even consider trying to reconnect. Every week, he'd bring it up again. "Maybe you should give them a chance," he'd say. "Maybe you could reach out. It might be good for you." It started to feel like he was pushing me into something I wasn't ready for, something that I had already made peace with not doing. But the real shock came when I found out he had been secretly messaging my father. I discovered it by accident. John's phone buzzed with a notification, and I saw a message from my dad. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They had been in contact without me knowing, without me agreeing. I confronted John immediately, and he acted like it was no big deal. "I just thought it might be a good idea for you to talk to your dad again," he said, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "Your father has changed. He's a good man now. He deserves a second chance." I was furious. He had overstepped in a way I couldn't even begin to describe. How could he think it was okay to go behind my back and contact my father after everything that had happened? How could he not see how wrong this was? I exploded at him, demanded he never bring up my family again, and for a moment he promised he wouldn't. But I should have known better. Not even a month later, I came home to find my parents in my living room. Part 1. I froze, panic flooding my chest. My entire body tensed in fear. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to run away. But before I could, John blocked the door. He stood there, his face a mask of determination, and said that I needed to let my parents back into my life, that I needed to face them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. I had been clear with him about my boundaries, yet here he was, forcing me into a situation I wasn't ready for, in my own home. I couldn't handle it. I snapped. I clawed at him, kicked him in the groin, anything to get him out of my way. I ran out of the house, not knowing where I was going, but needing to escape. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to calm myself down. My hands shook as I tried to breathe through the panic attack I could feel coming on. But then my phone rang. It was John. I ignored the first few calls, but when I saw that there were dozens of missed calls and voicemails, I finally answered. He was apologetic, his voice soft and remorseful. I had to choose the path that would allow me to heal, that he just whether that meant help me heal or letting go. He said he thought I needed closure with my parents, that it would be good for me in the long run. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that he had good intentions, that he hadn't meant to push me to the edge. But everything in me screamed that this wasn't right. I told him I needed space. I needed time to think. He agreed, and for the next few days, we didn't speak. But the silence only made things worse. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had disregarded my boundaries. I couldn't stop thinking about the man I had once trusted, the man who now seemed like a stranger. The days after Jake and I broke up felt like a haze. I couldn't sleep well, couldn't focus on anything. My apartment felt quieter, emptier than usual, like the space had swallowed me whole. I spent hours sitting on the couch, staring out the window at the street below, trying to piece together the mess that had been my relationship with him. I thought about the good times, the moments that made me believe we were meant to be. But then I'd remember the lies, the promises he'd broken, and the way he'd looked at me with that cold, distant gaze, like he wasn't even there anymore. I felt betrayed, but also maybe a little relieved, like I was waking up from a long, bad dream. But there was something about that relief that didn't sit right with me. Why did it take this much pain for me to realize how much I had been giving up? How much of myself I'd lost trying to fix someone else? Jake had never asked me to change, but I had, in small ways, over and over. I had shifted who I was to meet his needs, to make him happy, to make the relationship work, while pushing aside my own needs. I'd neglected the things that used to matter to me, and now, in the silence, I was left wondering who I was without him. I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I had to start figuring it out. After a few days of mulling things over, I decided to meet up with Rachel, a friend I hadn't seen in a while. She'd always been the kind of person who spoke her mind and had this no-nonsense attitude that I admired. I needed someone who would tell me the truth, not just comfort me. We met at a small cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and soft indie music playing in the background. Rachel was already there when I arrived, her back straight, a coffee cup in front of her, and a focused look on her face. "Hey," I said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Sorry I'm late." "No worries," she replied, giving me a small, knowing smile. "You okay? You've been a little off lately." I hesitated for a moment. How could I explain everything? How could I explain how lost I felt? But Rachel wasn't one to mince words, so I decided to be upfront. "I don't know," I said, feeling the weight of it all. "I broke up with Jake, and I don't know if I did the right thing." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a half smile. "Did the right thing? Are you kidding me? You finally did what was best for you. Took you long enough." I frowned, not expecting that response. "I don't know. It feels like I'm just walking away from all these years, from everything we built. Was it really that bad?" She leaned back in her chair, looking at me like I was missing the obvious. "Listen, I get it. You two had some good times. But from the outside, it always seemed like you were the one doing all the heavy lifting. You were always trying to fix things, hold it together, like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. That's not how it's supposed to be in a relationship." I felt a lump in my throat as she spoke. I had always known Rachel was right in a way, but hearing it out loud hit differently. "But I loved him," I whispered. "I wanted it to work." "I know you did," Rachel said gently. "But love isn't enough when it's one-sided, and it sounds like Jake wasn't pulling his weight, wasn't treating you the way you deserve to be treated. It's not your job to fix him." Her words stung, but they were also exactly what I needed to hear. I had spent so long blaming myself for everything that went wrong in our relationship. Maybe I hadn't been perfect, but I couldn't fix someone who didn't want to change, who wasn't ready to meet me halfway. I guess I just feel like I failed, I said, staring down at my coffee cup. Like maybe I gave up too soon. Rachel shook her head firmly. You didn't fail. You took care of yourself. And that's the hardest thing to do sometimes, especially when you care about someone. But you can't keep sacrificing yourself for someone who isn't willing to do the same. That's not love. That's codependency. I let her words sink in. Codependency. That hit hard. I'd always thought of love as something you worked through together, no matter what. But maybe I had been looking at it all wrong. Maybe love wasn't about fixing each other. Maybe it was about growing together, supporting each other's growth, not pulling one person up while the other just sat there, waiting to be saved. I looked up at Rachel, my eyes starting to clear. You really think I did the right thing? She nodded. I know you did. Sometimes the best way to love someone is by walking away. And by walking away from Jake, you're giving yourself the chance to find someone who values you the way you deserve, who doesn't need fixing, because they're already whole. I felt something inside me shift. A weight I hadn't even realized was there started to lift. It wasn't like everything was suddenly perfect, or that all my questions about what went wrong with Jake were answered. But I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I was starting to find myself again. Like I was moving towards something better, even if I didn't know exactly what it was yet. Rachel's words stayed with me long after we parted ways. As I walked back to my apartment, I let myself feel a little lighter. The future still seemed uncertain, and I wasn't sure what the next chapter of my life would look like. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to keep holding on to a past that wasn't serving me. I wasn't going to keep pouring my energy into something that wasn't going to grow. It was time to take care of myself. And that I realized was the most important thing I could do. The days after Jake and I parted ways were a blur. I spent most of that time in my apartment, just sitting with my thoughts, trying to piece everything together. My mind kept returning to the same question. How did it all get so messed up? How did someone who claimed to love me, someone I'd trusted, end up becoming another source of pain in my life? I wasn't sure anymore. I had always been the kind of person who tried to understand others, who believed in second chances. But after everything that happened with Jake, I started to wonder if I had been too trusting, too forgiving. Maybe I had allowed people to cross boundaries because I was afraid of being alone, of losing anyone. Maybe I had been too willing to believe that love could fix things when sometimes love just wasn't enough. I felt angry, but mostly I felt exhausted. It was the kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones, the kind that makes you wonder if you'll ever be able to pull yourself out of it. And yet, even in the thick of it, I knew one thing for sure. I had to find a way to stand up for myself. I couldn't keep letting others dictate my life, even if it was well-intentioned. That realization, while painful, was freeing in its own way. It made me think about the other people in my life, the friends I had pushed away, the family I had distanced myself from. The truth was, I had been shutting people out for years, not just because of my parents, but because I was scared of being vulnerable, scared of being hurt again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the part I needed to work on. It was time for me to start trusting myself, to stop letting guilt and fear shape my decisions. It wasn't easy. It never is. But it was a step I had to take. A few weeks later, I found myself in the same park where Jake and I had met that final time. I wasn't expecting anything. No apologies, no reunions. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, and I just needed space to think, to breathe. As I walked along the trail, I ran into an old friend, Sarah. She and I had lost touch over the years, mostly because I had pulled away from everyone who knew me before all the chaos started. But there she was, standing by the bench, smiling like nothing had changed. "Hey," she said, her voice warm. "It's been a while." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to walk away, to keep hiding, but another part of me felt this tug, this strange, comforting pull to reconnect. "Yeah," I said, my voice soft. "It really has been a while." Sarah smiled and sat down on the bench, patting the seat beside her. "Want to sit?" I hesitated. The familiar voice, the comfort of her presence. It was like stepping back into a time when things were simpler, when I hadn't been trying to figure out everything on my own. I sat down, feeling a little more at ease. I've been dealing with a lot lately, I admitted. Family stuff and some relationship stuff. She nodded, her eyes understanding. That's tough. You know, it's okay to not have it all figured out. You don't have to have all the answers. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I don't know if I'll ever get to a place where I can forgive. Not with my parents, not with Jake. It feels like every time I try to move forward, something pulls me back. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I think you need to forgive yourself first. I looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, she said slowly, you've been through a lot. You've carried other people's weight for so long, your parents, Jake, whoever else, and maybe it's time to let go of that. Not for them, but for you. You deserve peace, too. Her words hit me like a wave. I had never thought of it that way. It wasn't just about forgiving them. It was about releasing the grip that their actions had on me. It was about taking back control of my own life, my own narrative. I don't know if I can just let it go, I said, my voice quiet. You don't have to do it all at once, Sarah said. Healing takes time, but the first step is realizing that you don't have to carry their mistakes anymore. They're not yours to carry. I stared at the ground, turning her words over in my mind. For so long, I had felt like I was responsible for everything that went wrong. Like if I just tried harder, if I forgave them, it would somehow make it all better. But maybe, just maybe, they had to own their part, and I had to stop letting it define me. I sat in silence for a while, feeling the weight start to lift, even if only a little. There was something calming about Sarah's presence. It wasn't that she had all the answers, but she listened, and sometimes that was enough. After a while, we stood up and walked to the edge of the park where the sun was starting to set. The golden light bathed everything in a soft glow, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Thanks, I said, glancing over at her. For talking, for listening. She smiled. Anytime. As I walked back to my apartment that evening, I felt a shift within myself. I wasn't sure how everything was going to play out, but for the first time in ages, I felt like I had a sense of direction. Maybe the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least I knew I was on my own path now. Jake, my parents, all the people who had hurt me, they didn't get to decide my future anymore. That was mine to choose. And I would choose peace. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about freedom. Letting go of the past, of other people's mistakes, and finding a way to live for me. A future where I no longer felt like I was trying to fix things that were never meant to be fixed. For the first time, I felt like I was in control again. And that was enough for now.